My name is Susan Chastain. I am the designer of the Mother of Pearl pattern line. Welcome to our series, Pearl in the Pines Knit Tips.
And I'm here today to work with you on a wonderful technique, one of my favorites, for Fair Isle knitting called two-color woven knitting. Two-color woven knitting is different from stranding because when you strand with two colors, you end up with long floats on the back side of your fabric. This can make a fabric that's not particularly flexible, and it's harder in stranding to get an even tension than it is with the woven version of two-color knitting. So long time ago, when they did Fair Isle sweaters for fishermen with fingering weight yarn, the stranding on the back added another layer of insulation, which was great. But today we often want to have a little bit thicker yarn, DK or worsted or bulky, to do our two-color knitting, and we don't need that extra layer on the back. It also means that your fabric, if you're alternating between bands of Fair Isle knitting and bands of stockinette, that you're going to have a very thick section for the Fair Isle and then a thinner section for the stockinette. When you weave, however, the two strands bush into each other so it doesn't feel anywhere near as thick. It weighs the same because it's still the yarn, but it doesn't have that extra thickness. One of the things that I particularly love about the woven version is that when I learned to do Fair Isle knitting, I'm an American style knitter. I hold the yarn in my right hand, and I was catching my contrast yarn every few stitches to make sure that I didn't have super ginormous floats. The issue with that is that it meant that my yarn was constantly getting tangled, so I would knit half a row and then have to undo the balls of yarn before I could continue. With this woven two-color knitting, the yarns never tangle. You keep one color on one side and one on the other side, and they don't tangle. What you're going to be doing is knitting one color with your right hand, American style, and one color with your left hand, Continental style. And that's what we're going to be working on today. I will first teach you how to do the kind of knitting that maybe you haven't done yet, and also then we'll go on to the woven version. So what we'll do first is practice working with both hands, and then we'll learn how to weave the left hand yarn while you're knitting multiple stitches with the right hand yarn. Then we'll learn how to weave the right hand yarn when you're doing multiple stitches with the left hand, and then we'll put it all together. One of the things that I will caution you about, and that's something that I will be repeating constantly during the rest of this video, is that when you are doing any form of Fair Isle knitting, whether it's this one or stranded, or if you're doing the slip stitch pattern, you need to make sure that you're keeping the last 3 inches, maybe 12 or 15 stitches on your right hand needle constantly stretched out. Not every once in a while, but continually. You do that so that as you're bringing your contrast yarn in your other hand and knitting with that, you're not puckering the fabric in. If those stitches are mushed together on the right hand needle, the fabric will pucker and your gauge will change, which is one of the reasons why a lot of designers will tell you to use a larger needle for Fair Isle than you do for stockinette. For many of us, that's totally not necessary. As a newbie Fair Isle knitter, you're going to want to make sure that you do your gauge swatch both in stockinette and in Fair Isle in case you're one of the knitters that does need to go up a needle size, but not everybody does. The only time where that might not be the case is if you're doing a project that has very strong vertical columns, like say a piano keyboard that's knit into a piece. That strong vertical columns really do tend to want to pull in. So if you're doing something like that, you may need to use a larger needle. I'll also talk to you about a weaving thing that you can do that will help keep that from pulling in. So before we begin, there's a little pre-class homework that you need to do. I'm going to ask you to grab 2 contrasting colors of the same weight of yarn, and it can be DK or worsted or bulky, and get a 32-inch circular needle that's equivalent to the proper size for your yarn. In other words, if you're using DK, use a 6. If you're using worsted, grab an 8. And if you're doing chunky yarn, then grab a 10. Cast on enough stitches to comfortably knit in the round. The stitch count itself isn't really important because we're not making anything, we're just practicing the technique, but you don't want to be fighting the needle, so make sure it's really comfortable and you have plenty of stitches to make a circle. Once you've cast on, join it in the round carefully, and then knit 1 or 2 rounds to get a base on your needle, and then we're ready to begin. So here we are, ready to begin working with 2 colors. What I neglected to say in the introduction is that 2-color knitting does not refer to the number of colors in your project, but how many colors you work with in one row. So what we've done is I've cast on with my cream colored yarn, which I've put to my right, and I've put my rusty colored yarn to the left. In order to work with both hands, the yarn is actually going to travel exactly the same path, no matter which technique you're using. So I'm going to do 1 stitch with my right hand yarn and 1 stitch with my left hand yarn. So to knit with my right hand, continental knitting, I'm taking the yarn around the back of the needle and then I pull the needle to the front. To do the left hand yarn, you'll notice that I'm keeping my finger really close to the knitting needle. I'm putting my needle into the stitch and I'm picking the yarn through. I do 1 with the right hand around the back. And then with the left hand, I take the needle over the yarn and pull it through. And around the back, in and over and through. Same exact path. Around the back, over and through. What I'd like you to do is we're going to keep practicing this until it feels at least slightly comfortable for you. If it's new, it's going to feel a little different. If you are someone who knits Continental and does scoop purling where you're putting your yarn under the needle like this and you're knitting into the back of the stitch to correct the position of the stitch, don't do that for this. You need to knit with the going into the front loop. What we're going to be working on today is knitting in the round, and you don't want to knit into the back of the stitch when you're knitting into the round, or all of your stitches will be twisted and you won't have normal stockinette appearance, and your gauge will be different. So again, we're going in and over. In or around the back, and you'll notice when you're doing Continental that the yarn also goes under the back of the needle. You can use your left hand. I'm right-handed, so when I do this technique, I try not to move my left hand very much. I'm doing all of my motion with my right hand, but you have the option of doing some movement with your left hand too if that's helpful to you. And learning to knit with the other hand is great because that way if you get a paper cut, you don't have to stop knitting. Now I'm going to have you continue to practice 1 stitch at a time. You can rewind the video and look at it over and over again. And when you get to the point where you're comfortable, we're going to go on to step 2. This has nothing to do with knitting all the way around on your needle. You may find that you need to knit all the way around twice, or you may find that if you've done working with both hands before, you may do 2 or 3 stitches and be fine. Don't move ahead to the next step until you feel like you're at least slightly comfortable. For American style knitters, a lot of the issue has to do with finding a way to tension the left hand yarn, because your hand is going to want to go and go off to the distance, and then you won't have any control. If you wrap the yarn around your hand, you may find that you have a little bit easier time tensioning it. I'm also pinching it with my pinky, which allows me to tension the yarn. That's the trickiest part of this whole process for people that are predominantly American style knitters. Around the back and over and through. So once you get comfortable with this technique, we're going to go on to step 2. Step 2 is working multiple stitches with your right hand yarn and weaving your left hand yarn. So what we're going to be doing with step 2 is we're going to do 5 stitches with your right hand yarn, and then we'll do 1 stitch with your left hand yarn just so that you can remember how. When you're weaving, it's very similar to making a lattice top pie crust or making those construction paper placemats that we all made in kindergarten. When you're weaving, you have to go over and under and over and under in order to weave something through. If you go over, 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 it's not going to weave. Or under, 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 it's not going to weave. We have to do over and under to weave it through. So what we're talking about in order to weave this left hand yarn is we're going to be moving the position of the left hand yarn. What you've been doing when you've been doing this 1 stitch and 1 stitch business that we just did is that you notice that your left hand yarn is sitting underneath the knitting needles. And that will continue to happen on stitches 1, 3, and 5. Because when we're doing 2-color knitting in this woven fashion, we're weaving every other stitch. So stitch 1 with my right hand yarn, my left hand yarn is sitting under the needles as it has been. Stitches 2 and 4 are the ones where you have to think. So on stitch 2, we put the needle in, and then we want to get the left hand yarn over the tip of the right hand needle. Again, you can do this with your right hand. You can alternate the position just by moving where the needle goes in with your right hand. So stitch 2, the yarn is over my left needle. As I knit the stitch, before I bring it through, I'm going to lift my left finger just a little bit so the left hand yarn doesn't come popping through the front. And then stitch 3 is an under, which you've been doing. Stitch 4 is an over. And again, lift your finger just a little bit. If I pull really hard, I'll pull the contrast yarn through, which I don't want to do. So stitch 4, lift my finger a little bit and pull it through. And then stitch 5 is an under. Now I've done 5 stitches in a row, and if I tilt my work back, you can see that it's all woven in on the back side. Now that I've done 5 stitches, I want to remember how to continental knit. This is really important, particularly for those of you who are predominantly American style knitters, because when we weave, the yarn goes over the tip of the needle. But when we knit, the needle goes over the yarn. And right now I want to knit this stitch. So I'm taking the needle over the yarn and pulling it through. And I'm going to keep doing this. 5 and 1. Under, over, lift, under, over, lift. Stitch 5 is an under, and then I'm going to continental knit 1. Now I want you to notice as you're watching me that I am not, as I talked about in the intro, my stitches on my right hand needle are not smushed up toward the tip. I don't care what you do with the left hand stitches because those are just in waiting. It's the stitches on the right hand needle that need to be stretched out. I've seen people in class stop every 50 stitches and go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to stretch. You can't do that. You've got to do it all the time. So I want you to watch how I'm keeping this last group of stitches stretched out on my right hand needle. If I didn't, if I had them puckered and I pulled on my left hand yarn, it would pucker across the back of the fabric. So now we're ready to start again. 5 and 1. Under, over, keep them stretched, lift, under, over, under. I've done 5, and now I'm going to do 1. So what I'm doing is a 6-stitch pattern repeat, but I'm actually calling it 5 and 1. I'm counting number 1 as the first stitch of a new color. 1, over, under, over, under, and knit 1. So you're doing the weird thing, the over happen always on the even numbered stitches, 2 and 4. So if I were doing only 2 stitches, I would be doing the over on stitch 2. If I were doing 10 stitches in this right hand color, I would do the overs on 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It's always the even numbered stitches. Unless, as I mentioned in the intro, if you're doing a very strong vertical column, like a tree trunk or a piano keyboard, what you may want to do to keep it from wanting to pull in is do your overs on stitch 2 and 4 on the first row, and then do your overs on stitch 1, 3, and 5 on the second row, and then 2 and 4 on the third row, and 1, 3, 5 on the fourth row, alternating a little bit, and that will help keep it from wanting to pull in. So let's review it again. Around the back, under with the left hand yarn, over with the left hand yarn, lift, under, over, under, and do a continental knit. Again, watch the difference, ladies, especially those of you who are American knitters. This is weaving position. This is knitting position. See it again. This is weaving position. This is knitting position. If you are doing a few rounds and you come across a place where you see a stitch that's on the needle like this with the left leg in front, then you knit it from the wrong direction on the previous row. So what I'd like you to do is practice doing this until you feel comfortable. That might be for 2 or 3 rounds. It might be for 10 or 15 stitches. You just want to get comfortable because we're going to be learning a lot of new stuff today, and you want to make sure that don't move ahead to the next step until you feel at least relatively comfortable with the step that you're doing right now. So we'll do one more time. Under with the left yarn, over. I'm knitting normally with my right hand. I'm not doing anything weird with my right hand. I'm just changing the position of where the left hand yarn sits in order to weave it in. Now I've done 5 white. I want to do 1 rust, so I'm going to take the needle over the yarn and pull it through. Okay, so now that we've practiced, in fact, we'll do 1 more set so I get past my beginning of my round, which again doesn't really matter because we're not making anything and this is all going to get ripped out when we're done. It's just a chance for you to practice, which is an important part of learning any new technique. Okay, so that is step number 2, knitting multiple stitches with the right hand while weaving the left. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to work multiple stitches in your left hand yarn and learn how to weave the right hand yarn. That being said, as an American knitter, if I have a row of knitting that looks like this, and my next row is the opposite where I'm going to be doing multiple stitches of my left hand yarn, I just move the yarns. You're going to get some patterns, some designers who are going to say, always keep the right hand yarn in the right hand until the world comes to the end if that's the way you started your project. With woven knitting, 90% of the time, it doesn't matter. So if you're more comfortable knitting with the right hand, you'll also find that the weaving aspects of right hand knitting, left hand weaving is a little simpler than what we're about to learn. Then do whatever's comfortable for you. Put the yarn in that you prefer knitting with on that side. In order to learn this technique, however, we're going to keep our yarns in this position. And I'm now going to do 5 stitches in the rust and 1 stitch in white so that we can practice weaving the right hand yarn. The same thing is going to happen. I'm going to just throw in another one here so we can start from the beginning. The same thing is going to be happening here is when I'm weaving my right hand yarn, stitches 1, 3, and 5 are going to be normal knits. It's stitches 2 and 4 or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 that are going to be the weird ones. I call this the funky chicken. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you this one step at a time, and you'll get to the point where you'll be able to do it really fast, but not right now. So again, stitch 1 stitch 1 of rust. We're going to start with rust. Stitch 1 of rust, take the needle over the yarn and pull it through. Normal knit. Stitch 2 is the weird one, and the first thing you want to do is put your needle into the stitch. And now we're going to do the weird thing. What we're going to do is we're going to take the right hand yarn and around the back of the needle as if we're going to knit it. But we're not going to knit it. We're just going to sit it there. Then we're going to grab the left hand yarn like we're going to knit it. And I want you to notice that I'm keeping my needle tip high. I'm not pulling it back. I'm keeping it up. And then we're going to take the right hand yarn back and then pop it through. You want to see that again? It looks complicated. So let's do it again. Needle in, wrap around the back with the right hand yarn, lay it knitwise, pick up the left hand yarn knitwise. In other words, I'm not doing this because that's weaving, taking it knitwise, and then I'm going to take the right hand yarn back from whence it came, and it pops the stitch right through. Stitch number 3 is a normal. Yay! Stitch number 4, funky chicken. Needle in, wrap it, pick it up, take it back, then pull the needle down. Stitch number 5 is a normal. Now we've done 5 rusts, so we want to do 1 white so we remember how. Around the back and through. Stitch number 1 is a normal. Stitch number 2, put the needle in, right hand yarn as if to knit, left hand yarn as if to knit, take the right hand yarn back and pop it. Stitch number 3 is a normal. Stitch number 4, in, wrap, pick it up, take it back, pop it through. Stitch number 5 is a normal. And again, if you look at the back side, you're going to see everything is all gently woven in, no floats whatsoever. Isn't that cool? So we'll keep trying this again. It's very interesting when you're doing this that you may forget how to knit. A lot of people find that they're like, wait a minute, how does that yarn go? Do I knit this way? When you've been knitting for 20 years, knowing that you wrap the yarn this way, or that you wrap the yarn this way. You just have to take your time and remember what you're doing, because it's normal to have that brain fart when you're learning something new. Like when I learned to drive stick shift, I forgot how to use the turn signal because suddenly my left foot was operating and I couldn't have control over the rest of my body. So it took a while to kind of relax and get everything in place, and then it was fine. So I'm going to look back, see where am I now? I've done 5 with my left hand color, so now it's time to do a right hand stitch, so I remember how. I'm going to knit 1. Now I'm ready to do 5 left hand. Take the needle over the yarn and pull it through. Now I'm going to do the funky chicken, needle in. When in doubt, put the needle in. Look at your fabric and say, is this a weaving funky stitch or is this a regular stitch before you start wrapping and turning? This is stitch number 2, so this is a funky chicken. Needle in, right hand yarn as if to knit, left hand yarn as if to knit. Don't pull the needle back. Take the right hand yarn back. Now pop it through. A normal, a weird, in, around, under, and back, and pop it. And a normal. And we've got 5 rusts, so now we'll do 1 white. So here we go. And you will get to the point where you'll be able to do that. It'll go really fast. Don't try to do it now. Take your time so you're thinking about every step that you're taking, just like when I learned to drive stick shift, so that your muscle memory will happen. So I'm on stitch number 4, my needle's in position, wrap around, pick it up, take the right hand yarn backwards and pop it through. And now I'm ready for stitch number 5. And then stitch number 1 of this color. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1. And we're not worrying about what color's on the left-hand needle. If I were following a chart, that's what I'd be worried about. I'm worried about what I'm doing right now, or I'm worried about how my stitches are lining up right now with what they should have been on the row before. I don't need to worry about, well, I can't put a rust there because that's white. It doesn't matter because you're going to have opposite colors on top of each other all the time. So if this kind of makes sense, you're ready to go on to the big one, which is doing both. If you're not comfortable yet, keep rewinding the video and looking at it to make sure that you're understanding how these work. Now we're going to try putting it all together. Take this one out. And what we're going to do now is 5 whites and 5 rusts. 5 right hand, 5 right hand stitches and 5 left hand stitches. So while I'm knitting with the right hand, I'm going to be weaving the left hand over and under like we did a few minutes ago. While I'm knitting with the left hand yarn, I'll be weaving in the technique that we just learned. So let me just demonstrate this really quickly. I'm going to do, actually not really quickly, really slowly, really comfortably, 5 whites. So number 1 is a normal, yarn under. 2, the yarn goes over the tip of the needle, lift my finger a little, pull it through. 3 is an under. 4 is an over. And 5 is an under. Now I've done 5 white, so I'm going to do 5 rust. Normal, funky chicken, in, wrap, pick it, take it back, pop it through. 3 is a normal. 4 is funky. And 5 is normal. And it's one of the things that's really interesting about this technique is you'll notice that the weaving stitch that you do actually prepares the yarn to be caught on the next stitch. So you'll really, if you peek across the back, you'll really see that combination of motions is what allows your yarn to be caught. And you'll notice I have not had to untangle anything. My yarns are just sitting on opposite sides of the table. The only time I have to move them is if I decide, well, this color is going to dominate, so I'm going to move it over here, and then I'll switch my yarns over. But for right now, we won't. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Okay, so you notice, I'm noticing myself as I do this that I'm tending to stretch my yarns out on the normal stitches just to keep it. And it doesn't have to be all the way back. I'm all scrunchy down here. It's just this last few inches to keep them nice and stretched out. So 1, there we go. 2, pull it down. 3, 4, 5. So we're actually doing right now a 10 stitch pattern repeat, but I'm not counting this as stitch 6, so it really is on the chart. Technique wise, this is stitch 1 of 5. So even though I'm doing a total of 10 stitches, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And while you are probably saying to yourself, under, over, under, over, under, normal, funky chicken, normal, funky chicken, normal, you want to get to the point where you're able to automatically know that you're doing the weird thing on stitches 2 and 4, because when you're following a chart, you're going to be counting the number of stitches that you have in your row on your chart. So let's do it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, over, there we go, funky chicken, normal, funky chicken, normal. So this is an overview to two-color knitting. I want to just give you a sneak peek at two-color purling, just so that you can see how it works. Don't worry about it for right now. Many of you are doing projects in which you're doing, say, a top-down sweater in the round where you won't have to purl, or you're doing a cowl, you won't have to purl. So I'll give you a sneak peek at it, but don't worry about getting into that until you actually need it. I would suggest doing a sweater in the round before you try a cardigan where you're going to have to do two-color purling. So in order to practice it, I'm just going to turn my knitting around the other way. And I'm going to slip a couple of stitches over here just so that we're in place. Now, for two-color, for purling, where American knitters have the most trouble is figuring out how to continental purl. So let me just review that a little bit. When you're American style purling, you know your yarn goes into the Y. I'm going to be really gross and call it into the crotch, because if I say into the crotch, you will never forget. Into the crotch and around. When I'm doing continental purling, my yarn goes into the crotch, and then I have to do something called a rock and drop, where I rotate my needle to the right and drop my finger, and then I can poke it through. So it travels the same path. Crotch and around, and then rock and drop. You'll be able to find, if you haven't done continental purling, you may want to look at some videos on how that works. You'll notice as I'm doing this that my yarn kind of automatically goes here, and I actually have to move it out of the way when I'm ready to work with my other yarn. And again, because I'm right-handed, you can do all that motion with your right hand needle. So if I'm weaving on the purl side, I'm basically doing the same thing as on the knit side. If I'm weaving my left hand yarn while I'm right hand purling, I'm alternating whether my yarn is below the needle or over the needle. So for my first stitch, it's below. For my second stitch, it's over. For my third stitch, it's under. And I'm just rotating my fingers here a little bit. Over and under. And then I'll do a continental purl. And so I have to manipulate my needle to get it to get the left hand yarn to lay under the needle. Under, over, under, over, and under. Now to catch the right hand yarn while purling with the left hand yarn, you're going to do a similar funky chicken that you did on the knit side. Do a plain continental purl, and then on the knit side, you were laying your right hand yarn in knitting position. On the purl side, you lay it in a slightly different place. You're going to actually lay it around the underside of the needle because you want to trap it between the yarn and the knitting needle. So instead of laying the yarn here, I'm laying it under the needle. And then I'm going to start to purl the left hand yarn, take the right one back. It's the same process as on the knit side. Lay it in the funny place, and you can lay it all the way around the needle, or you can just lay it across the back. It doesn't really matter. Start to purl, take it back, and do a normal. And now we'll do a set of plain of everything. So under, over, under, over, under. Normal purl, rock and drop. Second one, get that yarn out of the way, lay the yarn under the needle, start to purl, but don't pull it through, take the right hand yarn back, and then pull it through. And a normal, and a funky. Lay the right, catch the left, take the right back, and pop it. Same idea as on the knit side and a normal. So that's a little sneak peek at Continental purling. Two-color purling. If you get really comfortable with the weaving on the knit side, picking up how to weave on the purl side is really not difficult because you're basically doing the same thing. The only trick is learning, for those of you who are American knitters, learning to get comfortable Continental purling, which you may want to practice a little bit. And you'll notice, because I talked a little bit about having the yarn going this way across your finger, if your yarn is this way and you rock and drop, you lose your yarn. So you want to make sure that your yarn, when you rotate your finger, that your yarn is going to be able to be caught. And again, the closer you are to the needle, the easier this is to do. If you say, well, I can't drop it because my right hand needle's in the way, rotate it. That's why it's a rotate and drop, or rock and drop, to do that. So that's a quick look at two-color purling. Get comfortable with the knit side first. In our next video, we're going to be talking about three-color knitting, where you are actually knitting with 3 colors at the same time in one row. But you want to be comfortable with the knit side first before you add in a third color, because that adds its own kinds of challenges. So please practice and have some fun with woven two-color knitting.